You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about Anene Booysen and how she named her killer. Was a victim who could have solved her own case ignored? You will hear many infuriating things in this case, but it won't be easy to hear. Those of you who aren't able to handle gruesome details of injuries from a sexual assault should skip out on this one. If you don't know, it is my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you would like to support me in doing so, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on and giving this video a thumbs up and leaving a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2013 in South Africa, and Anene Booysen lived in a place called Bredasdorp. Now, she was a 17-year-old girl, and she had moved to this town, which was only about 124 miles from Cape Town, right next to a beautiful beach. Yet there was a strong line between the rich and the poor in these communities, and many of the African-speaking residents had their own community, and this was made up of mostly shacks and people who were unable to find jobs, unfortunately, and it was definitely the more poor side of town. But this isn't where Anene's biological parents lived. You see, at the age of 4 or 5, her mother actually disappeared. Now, she had a brother named Reno and a sister named Anne Marie. At this time, they were all living with her mother, but one day they came home from school and she was gone. Now, there were rumors of there being domestic violence inside the home, so when their biological mother Chantel left, they went to find neighbors and asked them if they had seen their mother, and they said that they saw her walking down the road, but then she vanished. Now, of course, after this, they had to be sent to different families, and that is when they were separated. Anene and Reno actually were sent to family friends. They were a couple named Corlia and Marco Oliver, and they were so loving. They treated these children as their own, and even though they were struggling with money, they tried their absolute best. They often had to live with many families and had to work all of the time in order to survive. They barely had any food, and by the age of 15, Anene actually decided she should drop out of school to help out with the family and make money by working herself. She was often working at different construction sites in the area. It paid her well, and around this time, they didn't know, but their biological mother Chantel, who had left them all, was said to be in prison because she had been involved in the death of her 2-year-old son. They doubted that Chantel knew that the assault of her son would lead to a death, and so they couldn't classify this as murder. So she was sent to prison for 10 years for inculpable homicide instead. After a while, Anene found comfort in a cousin of her foster parents who lived alone, and so oftentimes Anene would go over there when she needed more food or somewhere warm to stay, and all she had to do was do the household chores in exchange for getting these, basic necessities when her family was having a really hard time with just those things. Anene was known to have such a rough childhood, but she remained this kind, quiet individual who would always help out whoever needed it, and she was so good to the people around her. She even volunteered at the Fynbos Wildlife Service, and she was so helpful with her family, and even when they only had a slice of bread and water to eat, she didn't complain. She was grateful for what she had. Anene and her brother Reno were actually so extremely close, and Anene would even go see her sister Anne Marie, who lived at a completely different house on a farm, just to make sure that they still had that bond. The only thing that worried people who knew Anene was that she kind of had a love for drinking and partying, but the problem was so many in this community did as well. There was not a ton to do for teenagers. They didn't have the money in this area to do much, and so they often would go to drugs and alcohol. And even though they couldn't get into bars, adults would often buy them drinks and they could go off and drink on their own, and some bars didn't even care and would allow them to come inside regardless. And there were also only 2 social workers in this entire town at the time, so they couldn't keep track of what everyone was doing. And this is exactly where Anene was the night of February 2nd, 2013. She had gone with some friends to this bar called David's Sports Pub and Bar, and this is where they chose to go often because it was only actually 6 blocks from her home, from that community. And her foster mother, Quillia, decided that she could go, but only for a little bit. And so once it got dark, Quillia decided to go and find Anene and tell her she needed to come home. Now, unfortunately, many teenagers like to backtalk their parents anyway, but in this community where children had to grow up and kind of be the parent regardless, kind of, help out with their family, they often didn't have much obedience to their parents, and in this case to Anene's foster parents. Now, she was respectful, but she told her mother that she was going to stay out a little bit longer, and her foster mother said, okay, well, you can come back at 1 a.m. then. So Anene went off into the night with her friends, and they were said to leave this bar around midnight, but Anene didn't return home at her curfew. And a few hours later, around 4 a.m., a security guard at a nearby construction site where these homes were being built from the ground up found a body. Now, he actually heard moaning and groaning in the darkness, and he thought he heard something, but he actually had to get closer. There wasn't a lot of lights around this area, so he went up, and then he immediately backed up, not knowing what he was seeing. At this point, he heard a faint call from someone who appeared to be in agonizing pain, and as he neared, he found the body of a woman that was next to the canal that was made to catch the storm water. And this woman was immediately rushed to the hospital, but she was miraculously still alive. She even tried to stand up, but she couldn't, and the security guard told her to lay back down, that help was coming. Now, this security guard was actually a 57-year-old father of 3 who told police that as he neared her, she had said, "Here, help talk net," which translate to, "Lord, please help me." He said that he will never forget the horrific scene, but he didn't really near the crime scene because he knew better than to tamper with evidence and to possibly ruin an investigation, so he stayed a little bit back, but close enough to tell that this woman was in the fetal position. She was in a horrific state, and he had never seen someone that bad. As medics got to the scene, Anene was said to hit and kick them and scream at them to not touch her, and Quillia was actually called outside by neighbors who said that Anene was hurt. She didn't know how badly hurt it really was, though, but she immediately knew that it was her daughter when she made it to the scene, because as they were loading her into the ambulance, she saw her black grasshopper shoes with laces tied in a very unique way that Anene always did them, and she immediately knew that was her daughter. And lying next to her at the crime scene were hairpins, a small glass, a striped hat, and a pair of shoes. These were all collected for evidence, but as she was rushed to the hospital, it was found that Anene had been brutally sexually assaulted, and she had a cut from her stomach down to her genitals, and her intestines were hanging out. Her face was beaten, her fingers and legs were broken, and her throat had been slit by a broken glass bottle that was lodged inside of her. The tear in her private area was not thought to be just caused by genitals. This was done by some sort of pole or instrument. Quillia said that she could not have prepared herself for what she saw when she walked into that hospital bedroom, and her daughter was sitting there on the bed with her intestines hanging out. And as soon as she showed up in the room, Anene called out, my ma, help me," and she immediately ran over and held her hand. But even the hospital staff needed counseling after seeing Anene. Anene had to be transferred to this bigger hospital in Cape Town, and before anyone knew it, this strong little girl had mustered the courage to tell her mother who had done this to her. She then said she was cold, she was covered with a blanket, she was saying she was tired and sore, and then she said she was going to sleep. And before anyone knew it, she was gone. Anene took some of her last breaths to name that killer, except she allegedly named 6 individuals. However, the only name that was released to the public was one, a name called Sway. and his friends. Now the problem was, Zwei was a very popular name in this community, and 4 individuals had that exact same name. Now some were their actual names, some were their middle names, and some were just simply nicknames. Police began looking for a suspect, but meanwhile, police found that the site where Anene was found was actually the construction site she was working at the time. Now the security guard was asked if he had seen anything strange up to this point, and he said that he really hadn't. Now, one of the residents had reported blood in one of the homes, but he said he checked it out prior to all of this, and it was simply an oil spill. He said that all of the homes were no longer under construction. They were done, they were locked up and ready to be sold. Yet the guard refused to go back to this construction site due to the amount of trauma from what he had found, and he said he was too shaken and tried to block everything out of his mind. The police then admitted that they could no longer fight crime alone. They asked for everyone to be in their home by 2 a.m., especially women and children. That way they could be safe, and a community actually formed the neighborhood watch, and they walked all night long telling women and children to get back inside their homes because it wasn't safe. They then asked for 16 members of the public order police to be deployed to this town for help. The problem was this kind of crime that happened against women happened all the time. This was no shock to the people of the community, and unfortunately this meant that they were not scared because they had become numb. The next day, 3 men were brought into custody, one of which the family of Anene knew well because he was her friend. He was also her brother Reno's friend, and they were all like brothers and sisters. Now, they never thought that he could be capable of this, but this was 23-year-old Jonathan Zwei Davids. Now, he didn't know his father, and he had a deceased mother who was killed due to domestic violence. He claimed that the police asked him if he knew Anene. He said yes, and suddenly he was being arrested. Jonathan's family didn't believe he could have done this either because he had no criminal record, but he still didn't have an alibi because although many saw him at the same bar prior to the sexual assault, they didn't see him at the bar during the sexual assault, meaning that nobody had eyes on him during that time. However, police also found a few other men named Zwei. Like I said, there were many, and there were 2 living around 100 meters from where Anene lived in this community, and they were both builders who were both named Mizandile Zwei, but with a Y instead of the I the police were first looking for. The first one was a 32-year-old who claimed that he didn't know Anene, but he was at work that day. He then went out to get some beer at the Windmule pub and bought a bottle of Old Brown Sherry to take home. He then took it home, he began drinking, and then he was listening to music, putting on DVDs, but he didn't go out the rest of that night. He said he was a drinker, but he didn't ever go to the pub that Anene went to. He said that it was very, very wrong what happened to Anene, and his live-in girlfriend confirmed his alibi. The second man was said to be an elderly man, but he said he didn't know Anene either, even though he worked at the same construction site that Anene worked at and was found on. But it was said that for the last few months he was recovering from a surgery where he was having kidney problems and had to have a catheter inserted inside of his bladder. So he said since then he really didn't leave his home. Reportedly, neither of their DNA was taken, and they were not believed to be involved in her murder. Then another man was arrested. This was 21-year-old Johannes Kana, and he was a rugby star with a 5-month-old child, and he had no Zwei in his name, nor was it his nickname, but witnesses claimed that he left the bar that night with Anene. Friends said she was laughing and she was having a good time with him, and when they left, they were excited for her because Anene actually had a crush on him. Now, Johannes was said to be friends with the first suspect, Jonathan Davids, and then after this, they were both in jail together, and the judge refused to grant bail to either of them. Almost a week after her death, the community put together a march in honor of her, and they walked through the town chanting, "Enough is enough." Her funeral was held at the Uniting Reform Church, and hundreds showed up to this small town, even coming from out of town, and they had to put a tent up because not everyone could fit inside. But Corlia, Anene's foster mother, said that Anene knew suffering, and at least her death took away her suffering. She says that she now sees kids in the streets, and she closes her eyes hoping that Anene will come back to her. The president, Jacob Zuma, said that this attack was shocking and cruel and most inhumane, and he wanted the courts to impose the harshest sentences for sexual crimes. South Africa is known to have the highest number of reported rapes within a year, and this is with 12% ending in an actual conviction. Even with the annual 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children, over 40% of South African women will be raped in their lifetime. Now, the manager of the ISS Crime and Justice Information Hub says that South Africa is a paternalistic society where women are not seen as equals even today. And apparently South Africa even has a wonderful Sex Offenses Act that covers marital rape, consensual sexual acts involving a minor, and the making of porn. But the stigma around reporting causes many people not even to come forward. Many are so used to the violence that they're not even aware it is violence anymore, and Interpol has even named South Africa as the rape capital of the world, saying that someone is sexually assaulted there every 25 seconds. It is said that a woman born here has a greater chance of being raped than learning how to read. Anene's case sparked an outcry for change, and mothers were begging for their children to be protected. Women were sick and tired of watching this happen and fearing it happening to them, and there were protests in the streets.
Bernardsdorf vowed that the teenager's death would lead to change.
I think we need to step up our efforts. I think in a more dramatic manner we will have to continue talking about this and not only leave it for the 16 days of activism.
I think our people take more responsibility for what they are doing and for their actions, so I think we are in a positive move now.
Ons gaat basically, dis dan nie meer in die van een of op my eie op 'n draailoop is, meestal dat ons gaan in groepe. Maar jy is nog altyd die veiligheidsbewustheid is nog in onderbewustzijn. As jy besef jy kan nie meer dinge doen soos laat aand op straat wees of iets soos daai alleen nie.
Media picked up the case all over the world, and it was the most high-profile rape case in South Africa. Yet this wasn't enough for change, even for Anene. You see, Jonathan Davids, the first suspect who was thought to be a friend of Anene's, who pled not guilty, was released. It was said that all of his charges were dropped May 21st because they had no evidence against him. They couldn't find any DNA to link him to the murder. However, at first, they had claimed that they found blood and semen on his shoes and his trousers, matching the victim. Now, Jonathan said that he believes that Anene named him because he saw her with Johannes that night and she thought he could help with the investigation.
Let's go back to the night of Anene's attack. What do you remember about that night?
All I remember is that she passed me in the pub, slapped my head and greeted me. She said she's here too, and I nodded. She probably mentioned me because she thought I knew her attackers. That's why I think she mentioned my name.
David says police were also wrong about blood on his shoes and scratches on his body.
Those weren't scratch marks, they were chafe marks. I was in a fight that Saturday afternoon before they arrested me. After fighting, I went to sleep. Then the police woke me up and locked me up. I can't believe they thought the worst of me. After all, they know me, especially a mother. I can't believe it.
But Johannes was still going to trial. The one man who was not named Zoe. The one man Anene did not name. Now, one of Johannes's friends and co-workers came forward to confess that he confessed to murdering Anene. He said that he had also been at the bar when the two were together, and Johannes allegedly showed up at his friend's house the next day after he had been trying to call him because he saw on the news that Anene had been murdered, and he wanted to tell Johannes and asked him when the last time he saw her was. And so Johannes just showed up at his door the next day, and he said that he had dropped Anene off at home. He said that he walked her home and that he whistled to her foster mother and another man saying that Anene was drunk and they needed to come get her. Now, he appeared shocked hearing the news that Anene was actually dead. However, when the friend of Johannes went by the police station that day, he saw that Johannes was in handcuffs. The officer looked at Johannes and said to tell him what he had just told the officer. And that is when Johannes said that he was sorry, but he did it. it was him. Johannes then made a written statement confessing exactly what happened that night. He claimed that he was at a party at a friend's house when they all went to this local pub around 1 a.m. Anene was there, everyone was drinking and dancing, and a little while later Anene was actually going to go home, and Johannes decided to go along. He said he then tried to kiss her, but she pushed him away, and he then pulled down her pants, kicked her, sexually assaulted her, and ran away. He claimed that he didn't kill her, that she had fallen and hit her head on a rock, and he pled guilty. But this plea was rejected due to the possibility of him getting a lesser sentence for it.
Going back to where it all happened. Murder-accused Johannes Kana points out to court officials where he last saw Bredasdorp teen Anene Booysen. Also present is state's witness Krishna Mentor. She has backed up earlier testimony that Kana was last seen leaving this pub with Booysen on that fateful night. Booysen was found raped, disemboweled and left for dead at a nearby construction site. After spending about 2 hours at the crime scene, the trial resumed 80 kilometers away. The court will now use this in loco evidence to get a better sense of Anene Booysen's final moments and the events leading to her brutal murder. Back in court, Mentor faced a grueling cross-examination by Kana's lawyer, who accused her of lying. It's emerged that Mentor was unsure of which direction she says she had seen Kana and Booysen leaving the pub, despite having pointed this out at the in loco inspection. Kana has pleaded not guilty to charges of murder.
After 8 months, on October 29th of 2013, Johannes Kana was found guilty of sexual assault and murder and sentenced to 2 life terms. His family believed that he should not have been the only one tried and that they should have kept looking for Moore's ways. Now, his uncle even clapped his hands and laughed at the judge when the sentence was revealed because he said that this is a mockery of the justice system and it was a joke. Johannes finally said he would actually speak out because he refused to testify, but he never did. His uncle also said that Anene's foster mother confirmed that Johannes Kana was never named by Anene. Many claimed that this one individual's sentence was not enough to get Anene justice, considering she said it was 5 to 6 men who did this to her. But police said that this was simply because she was in pain under lots of medication and was just confused. It was then revealed just how the crime scene was handled. It was found that the night that they took her away, they didn't cordon off the crime scene. They didn't keep it away from the public. They didn't do anything with it until the next day. And a forensic investigator arrived with a DNA dog and he went to work. He actually found a stick that appeared to have blood and semen on it. It was a huge, thick stick. And then he was walking around. He saw that a nearby home around the corner, there was blood on the wall. And then right below that, there were drag marks, as though somebody had been taken from that area to where Anene's body was found. Around this area, it was said that pieces of Anene's intestines were also on the ground. None of this was presented in court or at all, and when the officers from out of town came in to help, they pretty much took over. And nobody who actually knew the community or knew anything were helping. The stick was suddenly gone, as well as all of that evidence. Now, Johannes's lawyer believes that someone other than the police threatened him to take the fall. Now, a little while later, from prison, Johannes actually wrote a letter to his family, and they believe this is the first time that he told the truth. He said that he was with Anene that night, and that where the houses were being built, they had gone to have sex because Anene had agreed to it. And that they both unbuttoned their pants, and then she decided that she didn't want to. And so she said no. He paused, and that is when she slapped him in the face, thinking that he wasn't going to get off of her. And then he got mad, and so he hit his hand on the wall. He then told her that he would take her home, but that is when they saw 4 men, or they heard 4 men coming their way, and they were talking about hurting Anene. They then realized there was a boy with her and said they would hurt him as well. As they neared, Johannes ran away and 2 of them followed him, but soon enough they turned back, and he has no idea what exactly happened to Anene after that. None of this could be confirmed, nor would it change his sentence at all. But he also became an alleged member of an alleged prison gang called the 28s, and many speculated that this murder was actually the gang's responsibility and he had to take the fall for it. Even some of Anene's family have been said to question his sentence and if it really was him. The next year, on what would have been Anene's 18th birthday, Corleah went to her gravestone and put flowers that she got from some of her neighbors' gardens. And she also thought about the orange cake she would have made her that was her favorite. She was saying how the family didn't have money, but they always made sure that the children had cakes on their birthday, and Anene was always so happy with her orange cake. But Anene was ripped away from her family, never to have her favorite cake again. Then in 2014, Johannes Kana's family hired a private detective to relook into this investigation, and that is when witnesses came forward to say that they saw Anene with 4 men at the construction site that night. This witness said that she went to police with this information, but they chased her away, saying that they thought she was just a drunk. The private investigator also allegedly heard from more witnesses claiming that a few of them saw men washing blood off of a white car at a local cemetery the day after the murder. 2 more witnesses said that they had picked up one of the alleged suspects that had been brought in for questioning, who was hitchhiking the day after the murder, and he had a bundle of clothes in his arm as well as a scratch on his face, and he told the witnesses it was from an incident the day prior. The same year that the private investigator began the investigation, Anene's birth father, who really didn't have anything to do with her, named Classy Spielman, was actually killed as well. Now, he wasn't a part of his daughter's life, like I said, but he had been living in the same town when 3 men entered his shack demanding money. Now, Classy began to argue with them, and they ended up stabbing him to death and dumping his body. His girlfriend was there at the time of the murder but hid, and so the next morning ran and told police what happened. A man was immediately arrested in his murder, and that same day Classy was killed. Anene's foster mother, Corleah, was put in the hospital due to her cervical cancer. She had been struggling with it for about a year at this time, but it had spread to her lymph nodes and it was getting too hard to deal with on her own. And she actually passed away on May 14th of 2014. Also that same year, the Department of Higher Education and Training launched a world-class skills development program in Anene's honor. This was to help teenagers have an actual helpful place to go so they didn't turn to drinking and going to bars and doing drugs. They could choose doing this instead, and they wanted to give these children who came from rough backgrounds hope to empower themselves. Corleah, Anene's foster mother, was actually going to be overseeing this whole project before she passed. Then in 2020, Johannes talked to the media saying that he was convicted on hearsay evidence and that there was no DNA nor fingerprints to actually connect him to the murder. However, they could no longer ask for an appeal due to running out of money, so he was asking the public for help. He remains in prison today, and since this case, a woman named Alana O'Neill has started a shelter for abused women and children in the area and wanted to support families of gender-based violence victims. She says that many in the area don't talk about Anene's murder anymore because so many have happened since.
Wat het Anene Booysen se dood vir u gedoen? Die strate was vol mense hierna vir hierna. Maar na daai, dus alles weg. Dus almal weer tevrede. En hierdie kerkleiers besluit, hulle kom by mekaar. Ons het koppe by mekaar. Ons sê dit kan nie so aangaan.
Now, if you live in the South Africa area, there is a rape crisis number that you can call, which I will have in the description, as well as an online forum where you can enter your information that way and get the help you need. I will also leave the national crisis line as well for anybody who needs help in the world. But do you believe Johannes Kana was guilty of the murder he was convicted of? Could one man have done this and left such a gruesome crime scene? And also, why did investigators believe that Anene would have said a name of a man who had nothing to do with her murder? And why wasn't Zoe looked into deeper? Why wasn't she listened to? It was a miracle that she stayed alive to say anything, yet they continued to ignore her last words. But also, how can we help South African women in general? They should not have to be living in such a violent environment that is pitted against them. How can changes be made to such a violent epidemic? These women should not have to accept this kind of life and then become numb to it. They need help. They need to know that they deserve better. They need to know that they deserve justice. So please keep sharing Anene's story and many just like it, because there are many in South Africa, many around the world. But the fact that this continues to happen so frequently in South Africa and nobody is getting justice just infuriates me. We have to keep their stories alive and the injustice is at the forefront, so it gets harder and harder to ignore.
She was just like someone who's a dreamer, and he never talked. And Reno, her brother, I think he's older than Anene, I'm not sure, but Anene and Reno were very close.
Anene Booysen agreed to do an interview. He described his late sister as a quiet girl and said they were very close, but was later too overcome with grief to continue speaking on camera.
Ik ga in drank. Zo zie je ook, hij heeft ook altijd van gedaan in zo. Alle kan hij maar liefst naar van krijgen het maar niet doodgemaakt die. Van hoe kan hij nou die goede uitdaling zo?
I hope that you learned a little today about what's happening in South Africa. I had no idea. I know that sexual assault is something that unfortunately plagues the world, but I did not know how bad it was for the women in this area, and I wish there was more that I could do to help, but I am bringing you this story in hopes that it really does bring light and bring awareness to what's happening in order for bigger changes to occur. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.